I mean, we have to touch upon we have to touch upon the mammoth last battle scene and
Yeah.
the people jumping across on sticks. It's
I mean, I
fantastic.
think that's part of what I love about films like this. Even if I don't love the genre as much, there's
Yeah.
something about a western and something about an action film when it's done beautifully, when it knows its shots. Even if I don't like a Clint Eastwood movie, there's something incredibly beautiful about
Yeah.
a western film and how it shoots its landscape, which is very Americana because we have a great
Yeah.
tradition of that with like Ansel Adams and stuff.
It's Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Everything is Gay. It is I, your Don of the gay arts community, Magnus, and I'm joined today by my ever beautiful co-host, the lovely John MacDonald. How are you,
Thank
John?
you. Thank you. I'm good. I had my hair done just for today. That's funny because anyone that knows me knows I'm bald.
Mm, uh, you're looking spiffing as always, sir. It looks as if you had a lovely Christmas.
I did. I did have a lovely Christmas. I was blessed with many things.
Mm.
Kind of the opposite of what we're talking about today. What's interesting
Mm.
about our subject for today, which is going to be Mad Max Fury Road, is that it is probably one of the highest ranking action series. And the movie
Mm.
we're going to be talking about, Fury Road, is probably the highest ranking between that and Mad Max 2.
Mm.
Um, so I have a couple reasons that I'm not as big a fan of this series as other people are, but there's a lot to love about this movie, and I was really excited when you suggested that we talk about it.
Indeed. So just to give a bit of background to how we came to this today to our listeners, we were thinking to start the year off, we'd do a couple of road trip style conversations. Sort of like, New Year, let's get out and shake everything and out, get the dust off and everything. Um, and when someone says think of a road trip movie to me, um, it strikes the chord of transformation and like the journey. And I think of all the movies I've seen, there's few that rank as highly in terms of the journey as Fury Road did. So when we came across that theme, that did spring very predominantly to mind.
Yes, and Fury Road was written specifically to be this kind of. I think George Miller said in an interview, it ended up in the Wikipedia
Yeah.
page, that he basically wanted to write one long continuous car chase, and that is not
Mm.
one of the themes of it, but it is definitely a movie that features heavily car chases.
It definitely is one of the best action movies and dystopians that I've had the pleasure of viewing in my life. Um, and the thing is, when you really break it apart, like the different elements of it, dystopia, um, the car battles and stuff like that, if you're not really into one of those elements, then maybe it doesn't strike as heavy a chord for you as this does. But there's something quite perfectly done about the different aspects of this movie that we can touch upon the different things as we go along. It all comes together to be one gorgeous product, and I don't think anyone was actually expecting like this movie to be as damn good as it ended up being. Certainly, Mad Max as a property, people knew of it, but I think Fury Road came out of nowhere for a few people and really took them by surprise.
Well, it languished, and this is pretty common knowledge, most of the background stuff, but it languished in quote unquote pre production hell for years.
Mm,
Um, there was stuff that was going on with Mel Gibson that George Miller was very polite about when people would ask him about it. But
yeah.
at the time when they were looking to cast, Mel Gibson had pretty much run out his chances
Mm,
in Hollywood in a lot of ways. And so there was no way, both based on age and temperament, that he was going to come back to play Mad Max. So that was the first hurdle. But there was also so this is a franchise. The first Mad Max movie was made in 1979, and so that is a long time for
Wow.
any franchise. And to have the movie that people really love in this, so the highest ranking movie in this series is Mad Max 2, or as we in America know of it, The Road Warrior. Um,
Mm,
it and Fury Road are compared to each other. The Mad Max film that I remember probably more than any other is Thunderdome,
mm,
because I'm a big Tina Turner fan, especially Tina Turner in film.
yes.
And that's the one that gets spoofed a lot, because it's such an American classic. But no, this is a I hadn't realized until I started researching
Mm,
just how just how long the series have been around and how much it's influenced. Like the first Mad Max movie influenced Guillermo del Toro's body of work. It's apparently one of his favorite films of all time.
mm.
So the influence is profound, and there's so much to talk about in this film beyond it being an action film.
Yeah.
As far as genre goes, it's
Mm,
spiritually more a Western, which is why it doesn't resonate with me. Westerns have never really
mm.
resonated with me. I'm not quite sure why. That was part of why I couldn't get through Westworld season one. It was because it was set in the West. Um, but beyond it being so it's really more spiritually a Western than it is an action film, kind of like spiritually
Mm,
Star Wars is more of a samurai movie than it is a space movie. It happens to be set in space, but the tone of it is meant to kind of ape those
yeah.
samurai things. So here, when you look at Mad Max 2 especially and Fury Road are both
Mm,
specifically Western Western Americana cowboy frontier style like epics, which isn't
yeah.
bad. It's just not for me
Yeah.
in a lot of ways, except for
Mm.
Johnny Guitar, which is the best queer cowboy movie ever made, featuring Joan Crawford as a definitely not lesbian ranch owner. If you've never seen Johnny Guitar, it's a wild movie. Um, but yeah, so for me, Mad Max works on a lot of levels. It just doesn't resonate with me. I know a lot of
Mm,
people it resonates with. Um, I think the genre of it, the post-apocalyptic genre with the Western feel, for me works more in a video game setting. So like Borderlands and Fallout, which are
mm.
both heavily influenced by Mad Max. I gravitate more
Have,
towards them because I can explore instead of being on this kind of railroad path. So
mm. On a quick little note, I think Western's having a bit of a renaissance at the second, because not just well, you mentioned Westworld, and there's been, of course, spiritual successors with neo-Westerns,
yeah,
like Yellowstone, the really popular cowboy
Yellowstone.
drama, um,
There was the
and then,
one that I tried to watch where it was kind of a time travel Greek tragedy mythology with Josh Brolin. Can't remember the name of it. It's
oh,
very recent.
hmm,
I really wanted to like it because Patrick from Schitt's Creek was in it. But I just
hmm.
I could not stay invested in it. I tried so hard. Um, yeah,
In terms of games, not to stray too far off our subject for today, but in terms of games, there's been actually several paranormal Western
yeah.
um, open world games recently, Weird West, etc. Um, I'm not sure the reason for the resurgence. It might just be a number of factors at the minute have since Breaking Bad success, and then but
Yeah.
from there it's maybe had a bit of a comeback.
Well,
Um, hmm,
and I don't think it's actually off track. Because when you look at the way that Mad Max intertwines with other, not just genres, but also other mediums, um, Junkie XL is tapped to do all of the most of the music of composing for the follow up to Fury Road or the prequel to Fury Road. It's not really sure whether
Yeah.
Wasteland is happening or not, but Furiosa is supposed to be. And
Yes.
so they've
It's
tapped
yeah.
Junkie XL, who's done a lot more video game composing. He's done some films, but a lot of what people will know him for probably is video games.
Mm.
And the comics, the graphic novels that were made for Fury Road are still really popular and hard to find. I don't think I've ever actually seen them
Mm.
in person. They're that popular. And so
Ooh,
I
you
think when you talk about the Mad Max series, it's such a part of the iconography. It's part of the mythology of America, even though it's set in Australia. There's something distinctly American about it. And I think it's because the Western mythology of the American West is something that is only in America. There's no real
Mm.
comparative thing to it. It's always what fascinates me about the Haunted Mansion in Disneyland Paris is American Wild West themed because apparently in France they're kind of obsessed with the American West. I know the Italians created
Oh,
the card
interesting.
game Bang, but yeah, so the Haunted Mansion Disneyland Paris is Wild West themed, and that doesn't exist anywhere else because the
Hmm.
Wild West mythology is only really an American thing. It didn't exist before
Hmm.
we started pushing out after the Louisiana Purchase. It's a whole thing that is only American.
Hmm.
And ironically, Western films when they were starting made like all the Clint Eastwood movies that we think of as this like very American stuff are all based like I think most of the directors of them were Italian. So like there's a very Italian cinema feel to most high art
Hmm.
Western epics like A Fistful of Dollars or Good, Bad, and the Ugly. And so it's kind of an interesting floral circle international moment of this kind of mythology of the American West, of the open frontier, of the struggle for survival, of the battle
Hmm.
against the elements. And you see all that in Mad Max, I think.
You, you do indeed. Um, yes, this is touched on a previous point. You're right. Furiosa, the which is a both a prequel and a spin-off to Fury Road, is scheduled at the minute to come out early 2024.
Yes, it's
And
probably
they've got
still, Wikipedia says it's still in production though, so it may not be out in 2024
wow,
because there'll be a lot to
yes.
do. Interestingly, Fury Road, if it follows the spiritual path of Fury Road, most of its stunts and special effects will not be CGI'd. Um, on
Mm,
the Wikipedia page for Fury Road, it makes a point to say that stunts and special effect work was 90% physical.
mm.
And so there actually wasn't a lot of CGI in this film, which probably will surprise people to know, because as a movie, it's very grand and very dangerous, and it's hard to
Yes.
imagine anyone but Nicholas Hoult, Tom Hardy, and Charlize Theron taking it upon themselves to really go there. So
Mm. So I think a good way for me to really dive into Fury Road from my perspective is to first of all put it out there that to me, and this might be a slightly controversial statement, to me, it's not really a film about Mad Max himself. Um, I've always looked at Furiosa as being the central character of this film. Max is there constantly. He's a character in his own right, but he definitely, to my mind, feels like he plays a far more supporting protagonist role. And he's there in a way to, um, I don't know, how do I put this? Like, he's clearly present throughout the film. He's doing lots of actions, and he fights against the villains as much as Furiosa does. But she really takes center stage, and Max comes across more almost like partially a guiding force for Furiosa, like lending his support to her towards the end when she's looking to go on the journey after after the big revelation that the green paradise doesn't exist, and they're going to try and see what's beyond the salt plains and such. It's Max that has um I dare say the revelation, the moment of serendipity, and then he's the one that provides the guiding spark to Furiosa when they go all the way bloody back to the Citadel and such. Um, and then towards the end, when they've got back to Citadel and such, um, Furiosa's taken the stage and everyone is cheering for her. And Max is in the crowd and he shares a look with her. And then he kind of just goes, he disappears. He goes back to his role as the eternal wanderer, so to speak. So if nothing, so really, he's become an important part of Furiosa's story, but in that moment, in that key moment of her life, rather than becoming like a constant part of it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and it's not. So a lot of what you say, I don't think is controversial. I think partially it was because they were unsure how to have a Mad Max film without Mel Gibson, because he'd been Mad Max since 1979. And Mad
Mm,
Max was the role that set him into Hollywood. Like he was a relative unknown in '79 when this film came out. Um,
yeah.
so I think partially it's Tom Hardy and not knowing if people will accept a new, like people didn't know if they would accept Chris Pine as Captain Kirk after William Shatner had played the role for so long.
Mm,
So it's understandable
yeah.
to do it. But the other part of that is that there was such an intention in this movie to kind of I don't really know how else to say it. So there was an intention of feminism in this film that you don't see in the other Mad Max
Mm,
films.
yeah.
It's not just a product of its time. Between the way it was cut, because George Miller had his wife cut the film, um,
Mm,
who is it was kind of, I think she won an award for it actually. Also, there was a hiring of Eve Ensler, which is kind of an interesting, both well known and not well known factoid. Eve Ensler was the originator of the vagina monologues, which was a lot of her talking about her gender and all the things that came with it, both good and bad, and all the things that she'd been through. Vagina monologues is considered one of the most important pieces of female political theater ever, if not one of the most important pieces of political theater
mm,
ever itself. And so between Eve being hired on specifically to monitor and talk about violence against women, which is something she did in Namibia, where they filmed a large
mm,
portion of this, and the film being cut not necessarily with a male gaze in mind, but with the female gaze in mind, and with
mm,
the editing style that George Miller's wife has, uh,
yeah.
it was an intentionally, I don't know what the intention was in the writer's room, but the way it was cut, bringing on Eve Ensler, um, makes me think that it wasn't just a hedge of bets, that it was also trying to tell a new story in the world. Because the only real female character before Furiosa was Tina Turner. Like
Mm,
the iconography of Tina in Mad Max Beyond Thunderdome really eclipses any other female role that could possibly be, because for a long time Mad Max was about Max, the wanderer who wanders and who only becomes an altruist when he really has to be, but is a very selfish kind of person.
mm,
The in the first Mad Max film, it's like a tragic backstory of he's like a police officer in Dystopia, and his like wife and kids are killed, and so then he goes and becomes a reluctant anti-hero essentially. But Fury Road is so different from even that first Mad Max film. And so I do wonder if
mm,
it was an attempt to take something in a new direction. And it could have failed,
mm.
but it worked really well. And I think we're all very
Yeah.
glad that it worked really well, because it's nice when that happens. It's nice when people have more good to say than bad, and I'm thinking specifically of how people really love to trash the Star Wars third trilogy, which I think is trashed unfairly. So I'm glad Mad Max Fury Road didn't
Mm.
suffer that fate. So
Fury Road felt like a story set within the universe, featuring an iconic character, but it wasn't at all a retelling. It was something quite original set within this concept and such. And it could have failed badly. They try, as you mentioned, Star Wars, they tried to do something a little similar with Solo. It was telling a prequel story, yes, but there was potential in there to make it a very unique story about the character you'd never heard about before and introduce some background characters that informed him and his personality. Um,
yeah, Han
but
Solo works
it
better in book
handled
form than he does as an. I don't think that movie was ever meant to succeed. Um,
ooh,
Unfortunately, I
interesting.
think Solo was going to be a film that was never going to succeed, and I'm kind of sad that they tried to take um, Auden and Reckon Rare. I cannot say his last name to save my life, but the guy that plays Solo, I've seen him in other things, and
Mm,
his I hope his career didn't take too big hit from that, but that movie was never going to be a success because the fact of the matter is he came from a family of slaver pirates essentially, and so there's not
mm,
really a way to make that pretty unacceptable in today's society while keeping his anti-hero persona. I think that's one thing where Mad Max
mm.
succeeds, where
Well,
Solo fails, in
yeah,
that Mad Max himself, you can really imprint yourself on in a way.
yeah.
Um, Whereas Han Solo is a very distinct character with very distinct
Mm.
actions, and you cannot marry see yourself as Han Solo like you can, but it's always badly done, and everyone knows you're doing it. Whereas Mad
So,
Max, in a way, is kind of an avatar for this not lone wolf, but this kind of Clint Eastwood Americana cowboy,
mm,
protect the world male fantasy that we saw a lot in the 80s in very violent ways. But Mad Max himself is not a violent character until he's pushed to be, which is probably why the series works, and
mm.
has lasted longer than some of those other violent male fantasies in the 80s. Um,
Mm,
there is a lot of
yeah,
violence in the Mad Max universe. That's just the
yeah.
nature of it. So for anyone that hasn't seen it, that is interested in watching it, it really does deal with warfare and societal collapse, and it does not shy away from the horrible parts of it. It's very honest about what it is. It's very barren. Barren is a great word to
Mm,
describe the series as a whole. And I think that's something for people that haven't seen it or want to revisit it or want to show it, as kind of this Fury Road, especially as an idea of feminism. Just be aware
yeah.
there is a ton of violence in these films. They are not for children by any stretch of the imagination.
No, definitely not. But perhaps that's part of the charm and appeal of Mad Max and Fury Road. The fact that it is honest about these characters, and these characters don't make any um apologies for how they are. They've A lot of them have been shaped by the struggles that they've gone through to survive. Like, unfortunately, some have been twisted by it. The lead antagonist of this film, um, Immortan, I'm gonna get his name wrong. Immortan Joe, I believe that's how you say it.
I can look it
Clearly a
up for
tyrant.
you. I think that's right. Let me look up the cast for you. Yes. So it is
Yeah.
Immortan Joe.
So yeah.
One letter off from Immortal, which I have to imagine was probably there was probably a reason why it's one letter off from Immortal.
hmm Um, so he's clearly a tyrant. He's clearly been twisted by. He's clearly a tyrant and such. Um, so it shows how. But the thing is, at the same time, it's clear that he's attempting to imprint control over an order, over a society that has, is on the verge of like total anarchy. And in most case, like a lot of the cases, the anarchy is there and just bubbling under the surface. Um, and it's hard to be a good person in a dystopian apocalypse. Um, and you really do feel for it when when characters try to be good in these situations or try to take actions um to survive without being cruel and such. Um, so to go on to like one of the big themes of the film, which we touched upon, the idea that this is a feminine movie. Um, and it's very clear, quite clear it is. It's about the whole journey of the women trying to find freedom, from different perspectives. The wives from, you know, what happens to them. They're trying to do, they're on their journey to escape that fate. Furiosa's on her own journey to, because she was kidnapped when she was a child and she was sort of press ganged into being a warrior, for this warlord. So she's on her own journey, and in a sense, a redemption by helping these women escape their unjust fate and such. We're touching back upon the Western themes with redemption and with that. Um, I would say the landscape and the aesthetic also fit quite closely into that theme. I want to touch on the aesthetic in terms of just how stunning it is in a little bit. But the whole aesthetic of like the barren earth and the women trying to reach the lush paradise where the earth hasn't been ravaged by the effects of man and such, only to find that it has been destroyed. Um, and the remaining women are eking out, the remaining women of that tribe, they call themselves the Volanti, I believe they're called. Um,
That's very close. I
what?
don't know how it's I don't know how it's supposed to actually be pronounced. So
It all every element of the storytelling in this just so nicely fits together, molds together. The way the women of the tribe welcome like these newcomer women that are trying to escape their their unjust existence and like with open arms and such, even though these women themselves are facing hard times. Oh, it's just I could go on for ages, like just breaking down the separate elements for
I
each
mean,
part of the
yeah.
story.
And what's great is that there are separate elements to break down. This isn't just a movie that's about violence for the sake of violence. It's not just like this prestige piece. Look at this universe we've kept alive. What I especially like about feminist themes is that they so neatly tie into the idea of queer themes. I would say
Yes.
any film as feminist as this has an inherent queerness, even if it's not about gay characters. I
Mm,
think there's a lot you could probably make out of the kind of weird fanatical relationship and the push and pull between Nux and Mad Max in a way. I feel like you could probably read some things into that as to how that was written. Um,
mm.
and of course, Tom Hardy himself as a star has never shied away from queerness in roles. Um,
Yes.
not just because
Oh,
he's
yes.
especially famously said that he's definitely had gay sex because he's an actor, but like when you think about movies like Rock and Rolla, which he played specifically as a queer character, and of course Legend, where he played twins,
Yes.
one of which was gay. So there's really great whenever you do a film with such intentional feminism. Um, Exploring themes of violence, and I'm thinking of films like Sucker Punch, especially, which is very hard film to watch.
Mm,
There's really I don't want to tie violence and feminism together by any nature, but there's a really interesting thing when you bring them together on film, where you create this bittersweetness and this thing that is hard to watch but is so important to watch. There's something about a feminist film in an action genre that is really important. And I'm
mm.
not quite sure what
Yeah.
it is about that, whether it's about the honesty of it, or whether it's about the ability to give women a voice in a way they might not have otherwise and reach people they might not have
Mm,
otherwise. I'm not sure.
yeah.
And of course, being a
To me,
dude,
it
maybe I'm
feels
not the one to speak on it too. Being a dude, it's hard to say.
Yes, indeed. Maybe a good way to gently conclude that point is by saying it's important to be able to show women standing up against those horrible acts of violence and such, like standing up against it and saying, "We're here. We will not, tolerate your actions and such, and we are our own people, and we have our courage."
Yeah.
Um,
And that's one
and
of
that's
my critiques about Stephen King's work is he never does that. When I
mm,
think about it and The Stand, both of which have kind of those same flavors in the fantasy place, he never really does stand up for his female characters that he puts in those situations.
mm,
The Stand specifically, which as a book that has a road trip element to it in a very large portion, does not do justice to the female experience in the same way that Mad Max Fury Road does, and they are in stark contrast to each other. Um,
mm. And
yeah,
that may very well be why part of the reason why Fury Road captured so many people's attentions and remained a memorable film long after they'd seen it. Like one of the key elements of the reason of it, because of the fact that there's so many road trip films, but for once they really gave a demographic, a side of things that don't usually have a voice in those films, like the central position.
this is John McDonald, and I'm breaking into my own podcast episode. Everything is gay, even the straight stuff. Do not adjust your podcast TV sets, as it were. Um, so Magnus and I did an episode of Fury Road that you're listening to right now, and I realized about halfway through the episode, at our midpoint, that we were as fabulous as two gay men can possibly be. There was really no female voice to talk about um, feminism within Fury Road and about how this movie affects someone from a female perspective. And so I thought to fix that, I would actually bring in my dear friend Britta to talk about Fury Road and their thoughts on it. So it's not just two dudes talking about a feminist action film. So, hi, Britta. Would you like to
Hello.
introduce yourself to our dear listeners around the world?
Well, hello. How you doing? I am Britta K. I am a creative polyglot. I do a lot of different things from painting and drawing to music making to currently I have an online channel devoted to picture books for adults. You name it, I do it, or at least try it. And I'm a massive fan of Fury Road, so when John asked me, I was a little bit excited.
Yes,
Little
I
bit
was
excited.
so honored to have you on. I've been trying to figure out a way to get you on the podcast for a while to talk about like The Music Man or something like that, because that's a love
Right.
we both share. So I'm excited to hear your thoughts about Fury Road. And the way the episode breaks down is we started talking really about themes and about
Mhm.
where it fits into the Mad Max universe. And then we kind of broke down like favorite scenes and things you want to know. So like I guess the biggest theme in Fury Road that most people talk about is that it is more a story about Furiosa than it is about Mad Max, who is technically the lead
Mhm.
of the whole series. So Furiosa, the floor, the sand floor is yours. So as it
So
were.
yeah, so I actually went and rewatched it last night, which thank you. It's always I love an excuse to rewatch it. I've seen it probably 4 or 5 times at this point, and mostly on larger screens, which by the way, if you haven't seen the film, I really recommend as large a screen as possible. It's really quite something. And first of all, you're absolutely correct. It's Mad Max cameo. I mean, that's not quite
Yeah.
true. I mean, he's there a lot. But yeah, I noticed last night and in this latest viewing, he starts as the narrator and then it just stops. Like he doesn't actually narrate anything else after the opening scene. And then the few scenes after the opening are still very much Max centered. It's his entry into this part of that sort of hellscape post-apocalyptic thing. But yes, it very much gets taken over by Furiosa and frankly other female characters for the most part. I find that absolutely fascinating. For George Miller, the director who has made all of these films, and you have to understand, I was not a Mad Max fan before this film. I'd seen one of them somewhere along the line, but a dear friend of mine, Leslie Foster, who is an experimental filmmaker, a dear friend, called me up and basically said, Britta, I think you're really gonna love this movie. I know you're not much of an action person, but you need to see it. And he was absolutely correct. And part of it was that shift from yeah, male violence, patriarchy, yay, post-apocalyptic, I don't know what you want to call that, violence porn, and then it becomes something very different. And Furiosa, who is, obviously a kind of general, is the female exception. I don't think I saw any other women involved in military
Uh,
operation.
I would argue Tina Turner in Beyond Thunderdome is her
Oh yeah.
own special forces, but like that's because Tina Turner is her own special forces
Oh gosh,
in the
yes. I mean,
world.
yeah.
Yeah, so this series has been around since 79, and in 79
Mhm.
there was a lot of male power fantasies, but they were always like Charles Bronson, very violent underground.
Mhm.
New York is the battlefield, anti-Pep Benatar type thing. And so I feel like it was a way of reimagining the series, and it was trying to pivot a couple things, and it could have gone horribly wrong, but it didn't. And we're all grateful that Fury Road is labeled one of the top action movies, not just inside
Mhm.
of its own universe, but of all time, and as one of
Agreed.
the major movies of 2010. Like it will be remembered for a long time.
And what's interesting to me, because when I see a movie that really hits me this much, I tend to do some research, and I did some more research even on this viewing. And I remember George Miller's wife, her name is Margaret Sixel,
Yes.
and she is a film editor, right? And she won the Oscar for best editing for this movie, as well she should. The one thing that my friend, when he took me to see this the first time, he said, the action sequences are almost ballet like. And he's absolutely correct. They are so composed, they're so beautiful, they're so lyrical in a way,
Yeah.
and very little CG. Clearly they had to use CG to take out Charlize Theron's arm. They had to use CG on
I
a
just thought she
shot.
didn't have an arm. I thought that was just Charlize Theron, and I
I
hadn't been
know.
paying attention for years.
They did a really good job with it. And I know there was one other shot that had to be CG, there'd been a big crash, and then there's a close-up on an insignia. I'm like, yeah, that has to be effects. But other than that, there's really not a ton, and that's by design. I actually went and read the wiki on this last night, and it's nuts. She spent 2 years editing it, 60 hours a week, 10 hours a day, 6 days a week. It took 3 months to watch all the footage the first time.
Yeah. So an interesting thing that John Seal did, who was a cinematographer who came out of retirement for this film,
Mm-hmm.
is he did everything under 24 FPS for the film. So it was
Right.
already slowed down. And then having a female eye cut an action film is just something I don't think I'd ever heard of. And I had not read that she had spent that much time editing it. So,
Yes.
bravo. Definitely claps for that.
And actually, apparently, the last Mad Max had something around 1,200, different splices cut together. This one had 2,700. I mean,
Yeah.
it's really a gorgeous piece of work, and you don't usually notice the editing. And usually, if you notice the editing, that's not good. This is the exception to that. This is where you go, oh my gosh, who actually put the pieces together? Because
Yeah.
there's an elegance, and he said, I didn't want the usual guys to do it. I wanted somebody who had never done an action film. She's actually worked with him on Babe 2 and Happy Feet. And I love, by the way, that he does that kind
Babe
of thing.
2, more Babe in the city.
La la la. I love Babe.
Yeah.
But yeah, but she had this very, very different eye. And the fact, basically, they talk about how they feel like they're two halves of the same person. They're very in sync creatively. They said 98% of their decisions are the same at all times creatively. And so he was able to shoot on one end and know that she would handle it on the other end, and vice versa, like in a way that they both really loved. That's incredible. And actually,
Yeah.
this film, some people assume that a feminist perspective would be female dominated, and actually I think it has much more to do with cooperation than it does domination. So it's not that Max isn't part of it, for example. It's just that Furiosa often is the leader. She does defer to him, he defers to her, and they work together. And I think that Miller and Sixel brought that sense of gender cooperation among the two over traditionalized genders.
So this is something that actually really does intrigue me about this film, is that, and Magnus and I, if anyone who listens to the episode continues on after this kind of mid-break, we really kind of struggle with, like, partially I think it was because they didn't know people would accept Tom Hardy as Mad Max after Mel Gibson had played him for so long. But it was also the idea that this is his universe. He's the ultimate wanderer. He's, that cowboy archetype because it's more spiritually a Western in a lot of ways. And it's one of those things where, like, it's not that Tom Hardy was objectified in this movie, and Tom Hardy has shown a lot of comfort in playing both major and minor roles in films, but it's this interesting, like, push-pull where you expect an action film to have Tom Hardy at the helm, or you expect, you expect Venom where he's kind of objectified and it's a weird love story, or you expect Legend. And so, like, there's like a struggle to understand that in my brain. It's not a bad, I'm glad to struggle with it, but it's like something that I can't verbalize, but I'm kind of glad I can't, because I like being able to struggle with my cinema a little bit.
Oh, same. I mean, part of it is Miller, that it's been what? I think there were 25, not 25, 20-ish years between the last installment and then Fury Road.
It spent 11 years in pre-development.
Yes.
And that was in the interim. Mel Gibson had his major breakdown and became completely toxic to Hollywood. So it was also like, can we do this without Mel Gibson?
Right. Well, and the reality is that Mel Gibson is then a lot older as well. Has Max aged that much in this installment or not? Like, that's its own question. It has nothing to do with Mel. I would also have avoided Mel at that point. But Miller, people in 20 years also change a lot. I found him talking about how he said he has become a very, very staunch feminist because he said, I ended up around all of these incredible, strong women. And so his perspective on Max had changed by then. And that's interesting because I think a lot of male-dominated media doesn't want men to evolve in any way. And I'm not even saying a certain direction. It's like, no, we wanted Max. We just wanted Max the way Max was. And why did you have to mess with that formula, George? It was perfect. And George is saying, I think there's so much more here. And again, it's in that cooperative sense that Max. So I really tracked a few things that were very interesting on this viewing. Again, I've always noticed that Max does not feel displaced by Furiosa. If anything, he recognizes pretty early that she is an easy match for him in abilities, strengths, and probably superior in certain things. He doesn't seem to have a problem with that. Like, there's no struggle for Max. It's just sort of like the struggle is a submission to trusting her. That's the main struggle. It's not about can she do things. And that's very interesting. Like, no one in the film questions whether she can do things. As a woman, do you know how weird that is? The only other film that I can name like it is Wonder Woman. Where we walked out of the theater, a lot of women walked out of the theater saying, is this what men feel like after an action movie? Like, do you feel just that powerful?
Yes.
Yeah.
It actually has a title. I can't remember what the title is, but like, when men leave an action movie, after I leave a Mission Impossible movie, I always feel like Tom Cruise, but without the insanity.
Right.
Yes.
So yeah, but I think that Miller is one thing I think that Miller did here that is so cool and so powerful is that he understands that the action movie doesn't have to die if patriarchy does. Like, that's crazy because most people think of the action genre as a rather patriarchal genre.
Yeah.
Male dominated. Everything is about violence, and it's about men enacting violence and often on women or on each other. This film critiques that violence. I mean, oh gosh, one of my favorite characters actually in this film is Nux.
Yeah, I I always enjoy Nicholas Hoult in everything I've seen
Yeah.
him in. I kind of want to wax rhapsodical about The Great at some point because I think it's an
Mm,
amazing miniseries. But yeah, as Nux, there's a very mime-like quality to him, not just because he was basically dipped in white paint and sent to Namibia,
right. Right.
but also as a counterpoint to Max. And I also equate him to the idea of Chekhov's gun, kind of made human in this film, because
Mm-hmm.
he's got so much of that like fanaticism to the Citadel, and everybody has like Romanesque names, so like you can tell
Right.
there's a fanatical thread. And of course,
Oh,
Max is the wanderer male imprint character, so he doesn't have that fanaticism necessarily. But
yeah.
yeah, Nux is a very interesting character because like part of me is like he could be redeemed, and in a different movie maybe he would be, but like he's also Chekhov's gun, and he has to serve a purpose. So
I mean, I actually think that he was redeemed, and that's what I think is so interesting, and not by his death. I think that one of the hardest moments of the whole film is when he dies for me. I
yeah,
find that absolutely deeply tragic because I see him as an example that Miller is using to talk about where action, we'll call it action patriarchy, like action movie patriarchy. Action patriarchy has been in this fanatical space, right? Like Valhalla, like you mentioned Roman stuff. There's also Valhalla stuff. Like there's all these like ancient warrior blah things
yeah,
thrown in.
it's all 300. It's a
Yeah,
conversation that started with 300 about stylized glorification of violence and patriarchy, um,
yeah,
which is
and
also yeah,
this one goes full bore into that. For a long time, Nux and all of his guys are very much in that space. When does Nux actually come out of it? When he has been completely crushed as worst as he can in that system. The last thing that happens to him is, the leader, I will take you to Valhalla myself. And then he gets caught on the top of the rig with the chain in like 2 seconds.
yeah,
And mediocre. And like there is no lower point that a man can reach in the system that he's in the fanaticism that he has bought into, that has been fed him his whole life. And so all of a sudden, what happens? A woman finds him and sees him and expresses some kind of care. And suddenly he is able to be human. He is so human in that scene where he talks about like his buddies, the tumors, where he's got the smiley faces on them, which kills me every time.
yeah,
There's something so tender that almost nothing else in the film, maybe nothing else in the film, tops that relationship between, they call her Capable in the script, Capable and Nux. And it's probably not going to work. The guy's dying anyway. Can he be saved? Who knows? Like we don't know the possibilities, but I want to say that Nux is this example of the potential redemption and rehabilitation of someone who has bought into patriarchy. Like that's how I see him. And I am a feminist who absolutely loves men. And I don't believe that even men involved in the most toxic versions of masculinity are necessarily unredeemable. And I think that that is a very hard subject for us to talk about. Once somebody has gotten really bad, we just want to, as people would say, cancel them. We want them out. What happens if someone actually approaches that person with compassion and humanity? And I don't think it's a mistake that, again, it's across those traditional gender lines. I don't think it's a mistake at all. And Nux comes alive. Like it's
yeah.
crazy how much that awful, embittered, and abhorrently violent kid becomes something else eagerly when he's offered humanity. Max, for all of his other stuff, his humanity has not been destroyed. If anything, it's torturing him. The people that he was not able to save.
Yeah,
Something in his humanity is deeply tortured, but it's still very present. And I think that's actually how Miller makes that possible for him to be so cooperative with women. That his humanity isn't dead; it's simply in pain. So I
well,
think
and
that
he starts out, so the Mad Max story in '79, before Road Warrior, where he really becomes Wanderer. The
Mhm.
Mad Max story really is that he's a cop in Dystopia and his family gets murdered. It's like the start of
Yeah,
every single
right.
video game in Dystopia ever. It's like Max Payne, Borderlands, Fallout.
Yep.
So it starts with that premise of pain and then it keeps going. And something I found interesting in this film was the idea of likening Mad Max in kind of that trapped state in the beginning, almost as though he's another one of Immortan Joe's concubines, wives,
Mm-hmm.
however you want to politely put it.
Yes.
It's also a really interesting feature of a movie to take Tom Hardy's most interneted feature, which are his Princess Peach Super Mario lips, and put like a muzzle on them.
Yep.
I found that really interesting that they were like, the first thing we must do is muzzle this very
Yes.
hunky actor from abroad for our action film.
And actually, yes, on this viewing specifically, John, I dug into that because it was the first time I had noticed a correlation between his mask and, as they are called in the film, the breeder's chastity belts. They are basically the same thing. They are the only iron masks of any kind in the film that I can recall. There's other kinds of masks, obviously. But yes, the masks that are used for repression are one for women's sexuality, basically. Their reproductive ability in particular is being held hostage, and that is very clear from that. But it's so interesting that the correlation for a man would be his mouth, that it would be his face. Like, he still can talk. It's an interesting choice. He could still talk, but he is kind of muzzled. And I thought that was so interesting because for women, our power across history has often been thought of as sexual power. I remember learning that for the first time as a freshman, 17-year-old freshman in college, taking my first World Civ class. And my very French history teacher was like, and what power did women have in this society? And everyone, sex, yes. And then I should move on because that was thought of as women's power. And what the film does, the fact that they cut those off pretty early in the film, like the first chance that they get once they've escaped, that's the first thing they do. And one of them kicks it on the way out. I just love that. I'm like, yes, I
I
too
mean,
would kick it.
it changed among other things, but yes, the symbolism is very rife in that moment.
Right, but how interesting that the correlation for him would be speech.
Yeah.
Like in essence, a fuller sense of his humanity than just like one. Maybe I'm putting that wrong. Sexuality is a major part of who we are, and having it cut off is one of the most painful things about patriarchy. I have to say, having it co-opted, used, abused, and taken. But Max gets a little dose of what that's like. I think that's actually also part of what starts to connect him. And what I noticed this time was they don't take his mask off. They hand him the tool basically to take his mask off. You know, and she's trying to negotiate with him to like join them and not mess with them. And the one thing that gets him is, you know, I actually wrote it down. Where did it go? You want that thing off your face? And that's what gets him. That's the thing that grabs him. So yes, I do want this thing off my face. I do want to be away from this oppressing force. And you're going to give me the tool, but you're not going to take it off for me. He had to do it himself.
Yeah.
And I was like, what a cool metaphor that I had missed. Was this idea of like, yes, please join us, please understand our perspective, please team with us, but you're going to also have to do your own work for your own liberation within that task.
Yeah.
We're here for you, but you've got to in the end do it. Dude, that was so cool. I was like, that's just the coolest metaphor I hadn't clocked before.
Yeah. I also, so there's a few other things I'd love to hear your thoughts on. I kind of want to start with I'm going to butcher this name because I saw it on Wikipedia and I cannot remember how it said. The Villaver,
Yes.
I cannot say their
Yeah.
name. It's like trying to say, I referenced Solo in a later part of the video and I could not say Aiden Riker's name to save my life.
Right.
But yeah, so let's talk
The
about
women of the many mothers, if you will, that are left.
let's call them the many mothers because I can say
Yeah.
many mothers. I
I
can't
know.
say the other word.
You know what? Same. I went and looked at it. I'm like, the what now? That's fine. Yes, the many mothers who are not as many as they were. Whew, gosh, there's a lot to be said about that. I think that well, first of all, we haven't even really talked about Furiosa, and I think it's actually good that we sort of talk about her in the context of the mothers.
Yeah, because
That
she was on track essentially to probably become a mother before
absolutely.
she was kidnapped and turned into a general,
Right.
essentially.
And you know, as women have done throughout history, she made the best of her captivity. She got herself to the station that she could while still being enslaved, in essence.
Yeah.
as they all are. Everyone in that story, with very rare exception, is enslaved. Like there's lords and like maybe their sons. Like they were not. Other than that, pretty much
Here's a
everyone is.
weird question about Furiosa, because I know that you have some religious scholarly capabilities. You've
Mhm.
done some studying. Do you think there's any link, like narratively, where Furiosa is also kind of like a Joseph archetype, especially with his time in Egypt, where he like rose through the ranks?
That's a really nice correlation. I hadn't made that, but I think that you're right.
Yeah.
And interestingly enough, though, that is something that, again, women have had to do since time began, practically, but not always as successfully as Joseph. And I think
Yes.
that you're correct. The one
It
difference,
helps when you look like Donny Osmond in A Coat of Many Colors.
it definitely does
That
help
definitely
if you look like
helps.
Donny
Yes.
Osmond or Charlize Theron, for that matter.
Ooh, yes. I
I
wish I
think
looked like Charlize Theron.
she's spectacular, right? Like
Yes.
I love her as an actress. Like anything she's in, I will watch. Actually, one of my favorite Charlize Theron movies is when she plays I think it's the Secretary of State who then runs for president, and Seth Rogen is her speechwriter. Have you seen
Oh
that movie? I
yeah.
love it. I've watched it like so many times. It's my
You know,
favorite rom-com.
for me, Charlize Theron is not necessarily his performance, but like a good trope subversion is also Anne Hathaway in Ocean's 8, where she
Mm-hmm.
joins the crew later.
Oh, I
And I
love
feel like
that.
there's a lot of shades of that, where she like reveals how much of a stooge she is not, and that she's been paying attention the whole time.
Right?
And I really love that. So yeah.
Okay, I just have to say for the listeners, Long Shot is the name of that other film, and you really should check out Long Shot if you haven't seen it. Seth Rogen is a delight in it too. It's a great rom-com for people that don't like the typical power dynamics of the rom-com.
Yes.
For a straight rom-com.
Which can be very gross, by the way. We have not talked a
Oh,
lot of rom coms, but rom coms for straight people make me ask the question: Are you okay? Because like so
uh-huh.
often it's like this should not. This is not
Right?
acceptable in any way, shape, or form.
Right. My favorite to talk about, even though I do love this film despite my better judgment, is like Amelie, stalking in America
Oh
is terrible, but in France it's endearing. Like I used to joke about it. I'm like, I don't know, but it's a
well,
beautifully made film, but it's a little
yes.
problematic.
But speaking of stalking, Morton Joe, who is the villain of this film, but doesn't
Hmm.
feel so here's something interesting I learned that I talked about in the episode. Maybe this is something I'd like your perspective on. The sound designer, Mark Mancini, likened the war rig and these chase sequences a lot to like Moby Dick and Captain Ahab. So
Hmm.
for me, I find Morton Joe is kind of an evil catalyst, but really it's the wilderness, aka the sea of sand, that is more of the villain of the film to be overcome. Immortan Joe is bad, but he is still, at the end of the film, mortal, luckily.
Hmm.
Yes.
I I mean, I'm not sure I could totally. I mean, and my brother is a Melville scholar. And I don't know what he would say about whether or not, if we were to say, is Ahab the villain of Moby Dick, for example? I think
Well,
that
Mark
there could,
Mancini thinks so.
well,
So
but very
he-
much possibly. I don't know if my brother would say an absolute no to that. I think he might have some nuance to it, but I think that there's a point to it. He is, and I thought this at the beginning of the film. I've thought this before, and this viewing was no different. The beginning where they're tending to his absolutely grotesque, form full of tumors and all sorts of other things. And then they put that armor on him that is translucent, so it looks like his form is much more badass than it actually is. I'm like, again, you couldn't metaphor out patriarchy more. He is this sort of embodiment of the center of a patriarchy, or frankly, there is no center to patriarchy. It's the pinnacle. You're not talking about people gathering around a center. You're talking about people at the bottom of a pyramid. He's at the top. He happens to be the symbol at the top of the pyramid in this film. He isn't really fleshed out that much, but I think that just the way his physicality, the fact that he has that like terrifying mask, but it's actually an oxygen mask.
yeah.
That the first time I watched the film, it's killed me every time. I'm like, that's brilliant, because there's that sense of, don't I terrify you? I can't breathe. You don't. In full on patriarchy, you can't admit that you are um that you are weak. You can't admit that you're sick. You can't admit that you need any assistance from anything. and in fact you must look as powerful and terrifying at all times if you're going to keep power at the top. Have we not learned this from presidential politics of, say, the last, I don't know, 7-8 years? People just assume that that is a thing that's going to work, and it seems to be more and more popular as a tactic these days. But yeah, and he is visually interesting, and beyond that, not much else.
Yeah.
And I think that that's okay, and that actually happens with the warlords. If you notice, all three of the warlords are visually very interesting, and yet they're given no time. I love that too. I'm like, the film does not have time for you.
It's a really great subversion too, because in like when I think about RoboCop or Judge Dredd, the kind of more classic dystopian male action power fantasies, the villains are really, really sketched out. Even if you look at like Die Hard, and this feels like a subversion of that, where it's all of those women characters that would have been in like the 80s, 90s, quote unquote,
Exactly.
supporting and wouldn't have been fleshed out, and they are full of flesh here in the best kind of ways. It's Botticellian almost in a way.
Yes, actually, I agree with that. I think that's an excellent way to talk about them. And
I just wanted to say Botticellian.
Botticellian is a great word. I mean, I think that the I hate using the term, but it is the term in the film. The breeders are an exceptional group of women. They are also a very human group of women. The fact that one of them does want to go back once the first one is killed, that's a very human reaction. They're not made into some sort of perfect archetype of badassery, although they do arise into that. Some of them already have that there. Some of them need more time. They all really come through in a really special way. But again, one of the questions I had this time was, I don't know how they know Furiosa. I don't know how. I'm a little curious about like how that interaction ever happened. They're going to release a prequel next year, which tells me that a Sixel is in Die Hard edit again for a woman. And it's going to be Anya this time. What's her name? Anya
Taylor-Joy from The Queen's Gambit and The Menu, which I've heard phenomenal things about.
Oh yeah, I want to watch that soon. Yeah, she's going to be in the prequel about Furiosa's how she came to be, and I think that's actually very exciting. That not just Miller, but I think that the public is going to recognize, oh, she was so compelling in the first film.
Yeah,
we really wanted to spend more time with her. And again, the notion of Fury Road, Furiosa, the fact that part of me would have wondered, is that a name that she would have been ascribed as a general? It's a very military sounding kind of name. And, it isn't when she gets back to the many mothers. Oh, it's our Furiosa. She was named that from birth. And I think that she is the embodiment of female rage. I don't think that's all she is. And that's what I think is important to know about female rage, is that it's not one note. It's not rage at all costs. It is rage at very specific oppression, usually. Sometimes it can become more externalized, but in a healthy expression, an appropriate expression, it is liberating. And so the fact that she is the primary liberating force of the film, that she is the person who has snuck them out at their request, there is a sense of agency on the part of the breeders in that interaction, that they came to her, they asked to go. There is consent then. She isn't like, I'm getting you out of here for your own good. Everybody is on the same page. There's already a sense of team for them. But the fact that, I wrote this in my notes last night, rage might be the only thing this ultra patriarchy can understand. Like, how much rage is in this film? But they can't own hers. They can't own female rage. They've channeled it for a while for their own uses, but perhaps she had this in mind all along. I think she did, something like it. So I also really thought about, remember, what was the Ginger Rogers quote where she said, I had to do everything Fred had to do, just backwards and in heels?
Yep, that was Ginger.
And the fact that she's missing an arm feels like the woman has to be this action figure with one hand behind her back. In essence, like, that's exactly what I thought. Like, so she still has to be this much of a force, this much of a badass. And she, and this is not even to talk about disability, which I think could be another very interesting stream to discuss in this film. But yeah, that image of she has to do this all with only the use of one original hand.
Yeah.
I also found that is a very common thing that we as women feel all the time. That, oh, that's not a big deal that she achieved that. Men achieve that all the time. I'm like, yes, but Yes, but try it with these conditions.
I do wonder how much of that was because there was a special person brought in Namibia where they filmed this. They brought in Eve Ensler,
Oh, I love her.
who was the creator of the vagina monologues.
Indeed.
And
That's
so
rad. I didn't know
I
that.
wonder I wonder how much of that was Eve Ensler going, we should add in this disability element because this will add to the poignancy of Furiosa's character.
It's I don't know how early that choice was made, and I'd like to actually see something on that because it is so central even to the visual world of Fury Road. The fact that it's the skeleton of her arm is sketched on the door of her war machine, I think is amazing. Like,
Mm.
it's very, very clearly part of it. The device that she has clearly created for herself, again, maybe that's my assumption, but I really feel like that's clearly something she made. She figured out how to be functional in the way that she wanted to be functional physically. Anyone in that world seems to have to do that unless they're the ruler. So that's why it's my assumption.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think that now that you say that Eve Ensler was on that project, that just makes me super happy because I'm a huge fan. But also, I think that makes a lot of sense. Eve has been a force for. She gave this amazing TED talk. You can find it online. I believe she was in India, and it was how all humans should embrace their inner girl. That being a girl has been thought of as being weak, and she had such a huge counterpoint to that girls are adaptable and they are resilient and they are powerful. They have survived all sorts of things that people didn't think they could survive and sometimes did not want them to survive.
Yeah.
And the idea that, and again, that becomes a discussion of gender. You can talk about in a beautiful way through Ensler's rubric. You could talk about how Max actually embraces his inner girl through the force of this film. He embraces his inner woman through this film. The women have pretty much all embraced their inner man as well, as far as we're talking traditional forces of gender are concerned. And that's its own question, because I think that we can break down what those forces are compared to what they have been assumed to be. But nonetheless, I think that you see a coming together and a collapsing of gender as the team forms. It isn't about I am man, you are woman, we have partnered, and therefore, like it's not that. Part of me last night, I'm like, is this an incredibly heteronormative film? Kind of. Like, there's a
Kind of.
lot.
I argue a little bit for the queerness of this film just because of the relation, because how Nicholas Hoult does work. Nicholas Holt's
Right.
work all reads somewhat femme in
Yeah.
some ways, and so does Tom Hardy's work in a lot of
Agreed.
ways.
Mm-hmm.
And so when I see this movie, because I am a queer man, I can't help but linger on the idea of like Nux and Max, obviously, but like there's also the idea of, what if one of the major women of this film were a lesbian? What would that look like? What does it look like in this world for someone who is trans? Does that even matter? Because
Mm-hmm.
everyone is
Mm-hmm.
fighting for survival. So did we discard those particular labels just so we could get on with the object of living? It's so
Right.
hard to say.
Well, and I think that to add to your point about the leading male actors of this film, I think you could talk about Charlize Theron in the reverse. That there's something about Charlize Theron that actually often reads subtly masc. I think that
Yeah.
that's actually very true. She's done a lot of action. The Old Guard, isn't it the Old Guard? Atomic Blonde. What's interesting about Theron is that what I appreciate is that it hasn't stripped her of what is thought of as traditionally sexy for women. Mad Max, I appreciate that is not really part of the equation. But most of the time, she is pictured as a very powerful woman, whether in a fantasy scape or again something like Long Shot, but still very much also a full embodied woman while embracing masculinity within herself. That is actually, in some ways, at least as hard, if not harder, um, to acceptably pull off in our culture.
Yes.
You know, there's a lot of, if you're going to be perceived as sexually attractive to men, you have to be sexy at all times in certain ways, and you cannot be other ways. And one of the worst things you can do, I mean, I found out like 20 years later that the guy that I was absolutely nuts for in college, who was one of the most badass people I have ever met to this day, talked about how intimidating I was when I was like 18 years old. And I cannot tell you how much that bothered me, because I was too
Yes.
smart, and therefore I was very powerful, and I have pretty extensive experience being that kind of woman in American culture on an everyday basis. I have had people talk about certain mask energy and qualities that I have, and sometimes that's something I have felt struggle with, because that was not something I was hoping to necessarily embody, which that could have to do with just messaging about what I'm supposed to be, who I'm supposed to be. You know, I'm not saying that that's a good struggle to have necessarily, but yeah, I am a full makeup and dresses kind of girl. I'm dealing with some potentially into disability issues right now that mean I can't wear anything other than athletic shoes, and it's driving me a little nuts. I like nice shoes. I am a girly girl in many different, very specific presentational aspects. But as far as what I expect, you know, how someone's going to deal with me in a professional situation, I expect to be treated with every bit as much respect as any other person.
Yeah.
I have no fear of talking. I remember years ago, I was still involved in religious space. I went to a religious conference that was supposed to be this progressive kind of conference, and I showed up late. And it was a cool conference because they had 4 different rooms of 200 people each, and the speakers went around to the rooms, so you learned with a community. It was really cool in that sense.
Neat.
And
Yeah.
I show up, and whatever the first speaker set was, they were wonderful, and I talked in the session, because it's not a huge deal to me to talk in a session. As soon as that session was over, I had 10 young women my age come to me and go, "Oh my gosh, that was so great. We haven't said anything." I'm like, "What do you mean you haven't said anything?" I mean, you might think that that's not a big deal, but I think that women often still feel they don't have permission to speak. And certainly not speak with force, not speak with authority. You know, this is what the team needs to do, and we need to do it now.
Yeah.
We often feel that we have to mitigate our power, and I notice I do it too. I don't want to, but I think it's something that we adapt to, because we're told that we're going to be shut out if we don't.
Yeah.
Or
And
we,
and
yeah.
yeah, it's something in Mad Max I noticed in the entire universe. It's supposed to be set in Australia,
Hmm.
but ostensibly it does have this very American culture, and a part of that is
Yes.
that it is really definitely like of a stylized, almost Americana Western
Hmm.
fetishization. Pretty much the opposite of Johnny Guitar, which is the movie I always mention when
Hmm.
I talk about Western films. It's an interesting. There's something really interesting about the idea of the American West mythology and what that means for masculinity and femininity, which
Hmm.
by now we've learned is not the exactness of history, but the mythology of it was so strong, people still really buy into it. And so, like, the idea of gender roles feel like they're present in the Mad Max universe, not just because it's in that universe, but it's a reflection of our own.
Hmm.
But what's nice about films is that they don't do it just with words, they also do it in the language of both the edit and of costume and of presentation. And I think, especially because a barren dystopian universe, you have to dress up the people because the landscape it tends to be one color, which is yellow and sparse. That you get,
Right.
you cannot avoid you cannot avoid gender presentation in Mad Max Fury Road, especially.
Oh no, no. There's such exaggerated gender presentation, honestly,
Yeah.
between, you know, various versions of hyper masculinized warriors, to actually, and I don't know what they're called specifically. In my notes, I called them the milkers, which are the women who are nursing the babies at the beginning of the film, and then at the end they're actually the ones who open the water spigot, which I don't think is actually an accident. um but they are, very, very overtly overfed, you know, they almost feel like fattened cattle.
Yeah.
Um,
It's a very giver sort of scenario,
right.
almost.
And there is and they're being pumped for their milk at that time, and the men are actually drinking it. There's a sense of exaggerated femininity is necessary to feed the toxic masculinity of that patriarchal system. And that's no accident. I think that that's actually an exaggerated visual version of what has happened again for millennia. I think
Yeah.
that you women are treated as by turn sexual objects and fertility goddesses.
Yeah.
And so actually that's kind of the two archetypes that I see in this film, because I also found it interesting that none of the breeders looked like that. They were all relatively thin women. There were almost these two sides to motherhood that the film was trying to bring out, like this spectacular quote unquote goddess mother and the really down and dirty wet nurse mother.
Yeah.
And
And then you
both,
have the mothers that aren't mothers who are living
exactly
out in the swamp, and
right.
they have, no children, right?
Well, but
They're
they
not
did.
crones, but they're like, did
They
they have
clearly,
children?
yeah, they clearly have had children. But like they talked about, Furiosa was the daughter of one of them, of their
Yeah.
generation, and what happened to her, because that comes up. No, they clearly have had daughters, because there were people of different ages in that group. And I think that that's in its own fascinating. And I think it's also very telling that the only women in the story who are given the dignity of the title mother, if you will, as opposed to breeders or possibly something like milkers, is it's that group of women. And I don't think that's an accident on the filmmaker's part either. I think that the notion of who a mother is and who she gets to be, what it means to be a mother, when the mother is in charge, especially in the middle of terrible circumstances. The land is gone now. The
Yeah.
green space that they had is long gone. I'm always touched. I don't remember the character's name, but that one of the elder mothers has all of the seeds and keeps trying to plant, like over and over. She's tried to find something that'll catch, and she has that one little, it looks like a calf skull, but it's obviously tiny, but like that kind of skull with one little sprout out of it in this bag of seeds. She keeps trying. That's who a mother is. That's who an empowered mother in the midst of adversity is. The person that continues to tend to life. It isn't, I don't, and I'm not trying to say that the people, that either the breeders or the milkers are any less heroic. I think they are. I think that anybody who can seek to maintain life in the midst of slavery or in the midst of adversity or both deserves to be given the title of heroine, or shero, as I sometimes say.
Shiro, yeah.
I love shero. It's a great word.
It's a great word. Yeah, there's such a lot of really good stuff to pull back in layers in this film, and I want to make sure we
Sure.
don't miss anything while we have time. So are
Sure.
there any major notes before I start talking about other parts of it to talk about?
I've talked about quite a few things that I brought up in my notes.
I know we could rhapsodical about Furiosa for like hours.
I really
So
could. I really could. And
trying to stay focused. It's really hard sometimes. The Sabrina
I
the Teenage Witch episodes that we did went a little bit off the rails because we had so much to say
that
about
makes sense.
Sabrina the Teenage Witch.
I think a couple things I would bring out, and actually I wasn't thinking about using my biblical studies theology background in this conversation, but there is another, you were talking about Furiosa.
I think this is an action movie that almost like between the way they name people, the where they
Sure.
are at, there is definitely something in the
Sure.
same way that 300 feels like a religious story, in the same way that Cold Mountain, which is another movie with violence against women that is kind of beautiful and heartbreaking, that I kind of love.
Mm-hmm.
If I were to pair a movie with Fury Road, I would almost potentially do Cold Mountain, actually. Like there's something very
Mm.
religious about these
Mm-hmm.
films and the themes, because there's themes in religion. So yeah, like religious stuff from your point of view, more than welcome,
Well,
because we don't really cover that in the episode
well,
much.
well, and I actually see religious what people consider religious themes all the time. You know, if we were, not that it's my particular wheelhouse, but if we were to talk about Furiosa and Kali from the Hindu pantheon, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah,
But
and
you
of
know,
course, Thunderdome, Tina Turner's character, is based
absolutely,
upon a Hindu goddess. I believe it's
yeah,
Kali, but I could be wrong.
I
So
think it
there
is.
is a lot of that in this, and of course, Beyond Thunderdome was the end of that part of the trilogy, and you know it was
Mm-hmm.
predated by Road Warrior, which is Mad Max 2 abroad, because in America it was known as the Road Warrior. So like
Mm-hmm.
there was a whole lead up to religious
Right.
theology that I feel like Fury Road really kind of tacks on to. So
But there's a thing in the Old Testament that I noticed. I think I was in grad school the first time I noticed this, and I know I asked a ton of people about it, and I haven't seen anybody do any work on it. Maybe somebody has by now because that's been a long minute. But if you look in the biblical text, both the Old and New Testaments, and just for the listeners' sake, I've spent a ton of time in Jewish space and Christian space, so I can speak to both. Um, there are a series of songs and or hymns in the biblical text, like Mary's song, the Magnificat, or Hannah's song. But one of them in the book of Judges is the only hymn to leadership in the Judeo-Christian biblical text. It's about the leaders of Israel, and it's called the Song of Deborah. And the story is about Deborah, who was the judge, i.e., the ruler of that particular time, and her general, Barak, going to war when she calls Barak to go to war. At first, he says, I'm not going to go. Like, he almost acts like a chicken. You know, I don't go. I'll go if you go with me. And a lot of people in the Jewish tradition, at least, have seen Barak as weak because he said he wanted her to go with him. And her response is, fine, I'll go with you, but a woman will win the day. I see that as colleagues like yanking each other's chain a little bit for fun. I see it actually as humor. But it does actually happen. There is a woman named Yael who ends up in a position to drug and pretty grotesquely murder the opposing general. So that is the story that it's talking about. But you get into the song, and the first line is, the leaders of Israel called and the people answered. It's not one person. It actually is about Deborah and Barak, even though it's called the Song of Deborah. And I find that very interesting, that the only hymn to leadership in the biblical text is about a woman and a man working together. And in fact, there's a correlation between the general and his mother at the end of the same hymn. So there's a gender parity thing that happens. And I think that that is fascinating. And so when I look at, you know, Furiosa and Max, I actually see very much an archetype of Deborah and Barak. That Deborah is the one that calls Barak to the task at hand, and he's reluctant, but then he comes and does it.
yeah,
It's actually almost one-to-one what it is.
and there is a lot of really great and sorrowful religious imagery. The idea of having a vision that brings you back into the story, which is what happens to Max. There's a lot of really great imagery with the mothers that are still guarding the space that used to be green. There's a lot of religious imagery. I just saw a TikTok where people were like, here is whoever played Nefertiti in the Ten Commandments chewing all the scenery, and it's just like all the scenes of, I think it's Anne Bancroft as Nefertiti in Ten Commandments chewing the scenery. So like we're definitely back into a space of being able to look at movies both with overt and subversive religious textualness to them, and it's really kind of great. The one point I want to do before it leaves my brain is that
Sure.
what I love about Furiosa is what I wanted to see from Lilu in The Fifth Element, because I feel like they almost go there, but The Fifth Element is almost stopped by its own genre from making her a completely realized warrior in a way. She still ends up kind of regressing a little bit to give Bruce Willis his big moment, but like in a way, I can see shades of The Fifth Element in Fury Road. So it feels like The Fifth Element is part of that conversation that we have with 300, kind of going back to warrior, leader, general, and it's all because we all want more Leia Organa's warrior princess
Hell yeah, we
diplomats
do.
and warrior princess diplomats in film.
I mean, I'm all
Leo
for it.
Organa 2024.
Well, and I have a couple thoughts on that one. The first is kind of a side note, and then I'm going to speak very directly to something you said. One of them is like well, this is also directly. You were talking about how it seeds, in the Fifth Element, it seeds to Bruce Willis in his moment.
Yeah.
My favorite thing, actually, as far as like feminist Mad Max, is the fact that his biggest victory as a solo warrior in the film is off screen. It's when he leaves them in the middle of the night and says, "I'll be back." And he takes out like that whole group of people. You don't see any of that. You do see
Yes.
Furiosa taking out the vision of the warlord right before that,
Yes.
but you don't see anything Max does, and he comes back. Are you okay? Are you bleeding? That's not his blood. It's so funny to me because it's like so clearly like his.
Well, and that's a nod to the Terminator, because James Cameron openly has admitted as well that there are some shots in the Terminator that are like definitely lifted from Mad Max, because
of course.
so also, I know you love Guillermo del Toro.
I do.
A lot of Mad Max culture has influenced how Guillermo del Toro does film, because he's talked about Mad Max. I don't know if it's a specific movie or the whole franchise, as a kind of a big part of what he loves about film. And
I
so,
could see that.
Yeah, so I'd like to think Guillermo sat down to Fury Road and had just about the same reaction as everybody else did, I hope. So.
Well, and this that actually is a decent parlay into what the other thing I was going to say to what you said, because you were talking about the Fifth Element. Perhaps it was a genre issue.
Yeah.
When you talk about Mad Max as a Western, it's not. It takes a lot of influence and is somewhat homage to Western. But as you were saying that, it's also fantasy kind of Dune-esque. Like there are things that remind me of like the open land, the barren landscape and dystopian wars. And it's not the same as Dune, but I'm just saying like those kinds of post-apocalyptic fantasy spaces. It's a mix of. What's interesting is I don't think it has one fixed genre. And I think that that's also part of what enables more flexibility in how the characters interact with the genre they're in.
Yeah.
Because there's things that are, like you're saying, if you look at the War Dogs, you could see correlations between that and 300 quite easily. Like you've said, you could see it between a lot of movies where there's just like this force of young men who have been indoctrinated into a very specific way of being.
Yeah.
That's very violent. But because we've never seen that in real life.
Not at all. That's
never.
not a thing that terrifies me and I think about in my sleep in any way, shape, or form.
No, me neither. Yay.
Not at all.
Yeah, but all I'm saying is I think that when you're flexible with your genre, I think that you can create more flexibility in the story, of course, but also in the characters' interactions within the story and within the world.
Yeah.
And I think that that's a huge if you were to actually ask me straight up, like, what is the genre of Fury Road? I'm not sure I could give you one. I could make a composite of a few things. I could talk kind of around it. But I think,
it's a road trip movie at the end of the day.
I
mean, it's really one giant car chase, and then there's also death and disarmament. It's a car chase movie, that's all.
Right, and they come right back home. I mean, that's what you hope for. But I mean, there are people that simply would call it an action movie. I'm like, well, but it does have Western elements, but it does have dystopian sci-fi elements, I would call it. One could even argue steampunk elements. Just I think that it's a minor influence, but it is definitely a present influence. I think that there's a lot of interesting. I think that's also, it shows that let's just look at Miller's career, shall we? Happy Feet.
We actually talked about this a little bit in the episode. The idea that all of his films, whether he wants them to or not, all have themes of home and wandering in them, including the Babe films. It's
which I love, by the way.
It's a big theme of Miller's body of work, and I can't help but think it was probably pushed forward to by the edit, because if he and his wife work simpaticosness, it's just I mean, this is also his world. Mad Max is something that, even though we have all these people that have been influenced by it, he was the instigator in 79, and so he knows the world. So it's like if George Lucas came back to do a Star Wars film instead of like giving the rights away so all these other directors can come in. Like
Mhm.
then you get a very different set of prequels and a different set of
Mhm.
7, 8, and 9.
Mhm.
Because the person that created the series often gets a little more leeway into how it's done. And Mad
Mhm.
Max has always been an action slash Western slash post apocalyptic dune
Mhm.
fantasy. In a
Right.
way, it's always had those elements, but in '79, both George Miller and the people watching movies were very different
Yes.
people, and we weren't having
Yes.
conversations about feminism and queerness, or if we were, it was all indie or it was all on TV, and you didn't really see
Right.
it in films.
And actually, I think as you were talking about this, it strikes me that Miller is the originator slash director that we wanted George Lucas to be.
Yes,
Because George Lucas creates this incredible first trilogy of Star Wars films. I'm a massive Star Wars fan, just so everyone knows. Um,
samurais in space.
I love it. But of course, like an important note in that though is that the biggest uncredited force in the original Star Wars trilogy was the mythologist Joseph Campbell, who people
Yeah,
now look to for the hero's journey as a Hollywood playbook. I think it's a little overplayed, and I think Campbell probably agree. But nonetheless, there were people working on it with George. It wasn't just him coming up with some depth there. Even as there's a lot of wonderful light banter, there are some very deeper things happening in Star Wars. And then he gets a chance to do another trilogy, and what does he do? He leans into the tech that he didn't have before because he's really excited about the toys. He's so excited about the toys, he goes back and wrecks the first trilogy
yeah.
with those toys. Like, I'm sorry, the lack of
I
Ewok celebration at the end of Jedi is still something that roils me to this day.
Yes, yes,
There are problems.
yes.
Um, he wants.
I will say something that I talked about. Yeah, I think previously in the episode was when I compared Fury Road to Phantom Menace, because originally Fury Road was shot to be done in 3D, and the way that
Mm,
Phantom Menace done felt like the way that I saw it
yeah.
in IMAX was really the correct way to see it. And
Mm-hmm.
so there's a lot of, when we talked about the sandstorm scene eventually. There's something so grand in that scale. It almost feels like the 90-10 split on 90 real life, 10 CGI,
Mm-hmm.
and still filming like it could be done in 3D, even though it's not,
Mm-hmm.
made for a very successful, grand, epic picture, which is nice
Mm-hmm.
because epics are not always grand and they're not always successful.
No, and I think, but what's so interesting about Miller versus Lucas, Miller, I think, has stayed committed to his storytelling, and Lucas has not. I mean, I'm sorry. I'm glad that Star Wars was taken over by other minds. In that case, although they had to kind of wrestle it away from George, as I understand it.
Yes,
But Miller, in his 70s, brought something even better. It's not that the earlier Mad Maxes are bad movie, but this is like transcendently great for people like me that
yeah,
normally don't engage this kind of film that often. For me to go, this is one of my favorite films of all time, and every time I watch it, I'm a little like, am I gonna like it that much? And I almost like it more on further
yeah,
screenings. But the fact that he shied away from CG, which is an interesting choice as someone who made the Babe movies, which had to have some earlier forms of effects, right?
yeah,
And actually animated films. This is a man who is not unfamiliar with that tech. And yet he
yeah.
decided, nah, we're gonna build all of it and we're gonna overshoot it
We're gonna
and
do
we're gonna
everything in Namibia. So
right. And I think that there's something about that that is so deeply inspiring that I'm a person that even as an artist, I really still like physical materials and physical objects. If I ever make
yeah.
an NFT, I've probably been, brainwashed by someone. It's
Well,
it's just not me.
we talk about this too, because we did an episode on '95's Jumanji when
Hmm.
they were still figuring out how CGI would work in film. And
Right.
so Jumanji itself is very physically present, and the CGI is sparse because they didn't really just have the technology right at that time.
Right.
And it does affect Jumanji itself, and you can kind of see in Mad Max Fury Road, like if you're not computer dependent, there are certain ways you have to build scenes because we live in
Hmm.
physical space, and there's just nothing you can do about it.
Yep.
There's only so many green rooms in the world with people with Keanu Reeves on a surfboard to make him lie back when the boards are
Yeah.
coming out his face.
Yeah.
And that's something really important to this film, I think. It's not just the bareness of the land, but the physicality of the people against the land, people against each
Mhm.
other, and people forming community for better or for worse in spite of the barrenness. And the idea
Right.
that we, even in apocalypse, we gravitate towards community and each other, which is also
Mhm.
kind of what The Walking Dead tries to do but fails to do because it
Yes.
gets
Oh,
really
yes.
repetitive. It's not repetitive
Yeah.
here because it's a very short time frame instead of like 1,300 hours of the same thing happening over and over again.
Well,
It's Furiosa
yeah.
is a beautiful story about community in some ways.
Oh, it sure is, and
Yeah,
it has a runtime of 2 hours flat, including the credits. I
yeah.
mean, and a lot of films like
Which
Babylon,
is
I'm looking at
shorter than
you.
Pearl Harbor, by the way. Pearl
Oh, it's
Harbor was
shorter. I
longest
expected
movie
it to be
ever.
I mean, it really is, but there's a lot of movies that are just too long. There are things that people think that this is making it better. I'm like, no, you haven't put the puzzle together correctly. You thought it needed more grandiosity of length. And there are some stories that need more length, but that's most of them don't. But we were talking about something in there. Something I was going to say. I might have lost it. I might have lost the thread, John.
That happens with me. I've noticed. I tend to notice on occasion with that. We were
Oh,
talking about
oh,
religious stuff,
I
and I
got it.
got stuck on Luke Besson's seminal 1997 work, Fifth Element. So what do you have?
Yes. But yeah, I think it also has to do with, like you were saying, it is physical actors in a very physical landscape. It is not, they haven't been transported via green screen or any other means into a world. And I think you can tell. Like CGI always gets better and better and better across time. And yet at the same time, the more it's become a full environment of CG, the more I can usually tell. I think it's over polished, even when it's trying not to be. And I hope that there will be some artists that are going to take it in other directions. I don't think it has to necessarily be super polished. I do think that the way that television technology has progressed, though, that they try for things that are hyper polished because it looks better on these way too pristine screens. But whatever. That's a side note.
Yeah.
But as
That's
far
that's the
as
claymation puppet discussion. That's a different
right,
episode further down the road.
right, that is a good that's a good
It's when I,
episode though.
it's when I get to
But
my Willow Dark Crystal episode,
but
but that's a whole
still,
other thing.
arguably, if I have a favorite film, it's Darren Aronofsky's The Fountain, and that is not a film for everybody. I don't know if you've seen it.
I have
Um,
not. I think I have seen. I Darren Aronofsky. I've seen some movies of where I'm like, this is definitely a movie that I've seen. So,
I happen to really love him because I like how off the rails he often he's like rides that rail, and sometimes like Mother he fell off. That film I was like, what?
Mother is a
Um,
hard. Mother is a film all on its own to discuss,
yeah,
especially if you want to do like discussion of religious texts. Mother
right.
really goes there.
Yeah, I almost felt like it was a little bit too. Yep, you took Yep, that's very literally what you. Okay,
Very
but
literally.
Noah actually is a film that I could talk about for days because I actually love Noah, and I think that it was especially Christian audiences didn't get it. But
I think you could actually do a really great comparison between Noah and Fury Road, just
mm-hmm,
because of kind of the religiousness in both of them. Religiousness in both of them.
yeah,
And
yeah,
there are some, I mean, it's not a one for one, obviously,
right,
but I think
but
Mad Max as a series could be potentially read very religious. You've got kind of
sure,
that lone wanderer character who isn't an altruist, but then when he's in community, all of a sudden he's kind of a savior type.
mm-hmm,
Um, yeah, I'm
right.
really glad Tom Hardy took over the role because I feel like
Oh,
if
he's
any
great.
other male actor would have done it, it could have been very easy to like overshadow who Max was in this film, if that
Yeah,
makes
I
sense.
agree. But yeah, I'm going to finish my point real quick about The Fountain because it's the only other film that I can think of that is a genre bending film. You could argue that it's fantasy, you could argue that it's sci-fi, you could argue that it is oh gosh, contemporary drama, recognizable drama. All there are 3 different plot lines, each 500 years apart from each other. And it's, by the way, if you ever watch it, just be prepared. It's more, I call it a meditation rather than a plot line. So if you're looking for a really, really strong through, it's a little bit different. They're almost these little parallel things happening with the same actors.
Yes.
But what I wanted to say was it's another film that uses little to no CGI. And if you watch it, you're like, how? Because Aronofsky chose to do things in very, very intricately staged ways, especially with light and reflection, that are really unusual. There are certain scenes I look at, I'm like, I don't know how he ever figured that out, but it makes the film feel visceral, and that's the word I want to use for Fury Road too. There's this sense of like I could almost touch it because it's going to have texture.
And
It's
probably some sand.
yeah,
You're gonna get
you're
sand and
definitely gonna
blood
have
on
some
your
sand.
hands.
It's gonna happen. So yeah. Anyway, but actually, if I was gonna put two films together, I hadn't thought about it, but I might put those together for different reasons. Because
Yeah.
visually, I think they would speak to each other really interestingly.
That's good.
They're both films I
yes.
like to watch in the dark,
Nice.
which
I
is not my
appreciate
usual
that.
thing.
So there's about 8 minutes left on
Yes.
this before we break back into the regularly scheduled episode. I'm gonna do this really cool editing thing where it's like mid-sequence episode break. It's gonna be great. So in the 8 minutes you have left, are there any things you kind of want to wrap up with Fury Road that you really want to talk about? I'll just give you like an open floor for 8 minutes. This is your moment.
Oh my gosh. Finally, I've arrived. I think, interestingly enough, on this last viewing, there was this little tiny detail in the script that I hadn't really thought a thing about before. It's I think it might be the only like 2 or 3 lines between the warlords, because there's not a lot of dialogue between them. They've been summoned because there's the lord in charge of Gastown, there's a lord in charge of the Bullet Farm. And the two of them are talking, as Joe is like losing his mind about all of this stuff is terrible, rah. And they're looking at each other like, this is, basically it's like, this is such bullshit. They're like, this is a family squabble. All this over a family squabble might be the line. And that really hit me deeply, because the idea that there was an assumption that women as property equaled family was a deeper idea that I hadn't really thought about. Because he does, Joe, talks about the baby that is lost in the film still in utero as my property. Clearly, he thinks of the women as his property in a really scary sense. Even though he's given them quote unquote luxury, they are very much imprisoned by him, but they are family. And I think that is one of the darker realities of what patriarchy has taught us for a long time, is specifically that women are property, and possibly, unless we undo notions of property, that people are property, that our families are property somehow. And you have a counterpoint to that in the kind of family-esque team that's built by Furiosa and Max and the breeders and Nux, and eventually the mothers. There is a sense of, there is that, you talked about how Miller focuses on home, but there is also a focus on family. And I think briefly, quite subtly highlighting what family has often been, often throughout history legally, but it hasn't been that way for a while in most cultures. But still, we can have that attitude that in a relationship, in a family, women are the property of men. That's an exaggeration, but I think that we still need to deal with the residual nature of that. That's what really struck me about that comment, that nobody is property of anybody. Even couples often sometimes talk about, you're mine, I'm yours. Some of that's perfectly fine, I think, but some of that really is still lending into that idea. And family, as Fury Road shows it, family is a lot more about, the word that kept coming up to me was submission, and actually mutual submission. That there's a trust that if I submit to being part of this, if I am not in charge, and I would actually include Furiosa. Furiosa is in charge, but she's also kind of not. she's part of a team. I've been what is it I've been watching? We've been watching Letterkenny. No, it's not Letterkenny. What was it? No, we've been watching
Letterkenny's a great show to watch. I don't know if I
Yeah.
would say it's feminist necessarily, but I guess there is a lot
Well,
of
we
that
could. That's a
now with it.
whole other. We've been
That's a
watching that.
different episode. I do love
Yeah.
Letterkenny, folks. I know that will surprise some of you, but Letterkenny, I think, is an amazing
I love
show.
it. Sorry, we were watching two shows, and I was like, "What was it?" No, it was that, and we were watching the later seasons of Doctor Who, and the latest Doctor, who is the first woman, Jodie Whittaker. One of her verbal tics in her case is we have a flat team structure. I love that because she's the Doctor, but we have a flat team structure. And she has to explain this to allies and enemies alike. It's kind of amazing. And that's kind of what I feel like Fury Road says about team and about family. Like, it's a flat team structure. It doesn't have to be somebody owns somebody. It doesn't have to be, Furiosa is an imperator. The term, she commands, she gives imperatives. That is literally what they have called her. And she accepts some of those things, but also lays them down in order to be part of a group that is empowering as opposed to just listening to her commands.
It's also a really interesting point in the film, too, to go from this pinnacle structure with Immortan Joe on top. And almost the second you're no longer in that structure, you create one that's more suited to everybody equally.
Yeah, exactly.
I'm not saying the film is promoting socialism, but the film kind of promotes socialism just a little bit.
I can't not say that the film isn't. Yeah, I mean,
I can't legally say. I mean, I don't have like people making me do commercials, but like, I can't legally say that because I live in America.
Yeah,
capitalism.
And I think that another thing the film does in the same kind of vein is that it breaks down this idea that if a person has personal power, they can't be part of something communal. Because often action movies do center around like the one loner, badass, whatever. And even if someone goes back into loner status, I believe that Max could show up at any time in that timeline and then be a part of it again. And I think that that's very special, that there's this idea that even your power is not diminished by being part of a team. I believe it is actually enhanced. And the less time you give to the loss of your own power, Max doesn't take any time to care about it. Not a bit. Once again, the question is trust, not ability. And he has very little ego for a guy in a film like this. But he knows who he is. He knows what he's capable of. He sees who the people are around him and what they're capable of, and he chooses to trust it. And he's right to trust it. So, and they are able to give and take. He is the one that comes up with the final idea, not Furiosa.
Yeah,
I think it's important they both do that at different times.
There's that beautiful kind of transfusion scene. I mean, it's very gritty and it's very, there's a very beautiful bittersweetness to the movie because you're like, it's a beautiful film, but it's also kind of horrible at the same time.
Oh gosh, no, it is beautiful though.
That transfusion scene is really something.
The fact
that
he
sticks with you, yeah.
He has refused to give her his name, and suddenly she's unconscious, and he wants to save her. And he goes, my name is Max." I can never get through that without crying because I think that is the ultimate
I'm an
symbol
American male, so I don't cry. Just generally speaking.
Obviously. I've watched many things with you, and
yes, never tear up. Speaking of never tearing up, we only have a minute left. On this interview, and I want to thank you so much. Is there any last minute thing that you'd like to say, Britta, about either the film or to the world?
I actually think I would like to just say, if you haven't watched this film and if you haven't given it a chance, please try it. Even if it is not a set of genres that you usually find interesting, this is one of those films that I believe is an outlier. I think it is so beautifully made that if you give it a shot, you might really be surprised by it. I think you might really love it. It is definitely in my top at least 10 films of all time, at least. So, highly recommend, and I'm thrilled to be here.
Thank you so much.
I have loved this.
Thank you, Britta. Thank you for breaking into the episode. I'll just have you break into episodes every now and then.
I kind of like that. Here's a Britta break.
Here's a Britta break. It's one of my favorite breaks of all time. Right up there with Kid Cap breaks. So a couple of the themes that we haven't touched on that I kind of would like to before we talk about scenes we like, or other things. The sound designer, Mark Mangini, stated that he viewed the War Rig, and I think the War Rig is the car that either Nux or Morden Joe drives throughout the film. One
I
of the
believe it's
vehicles is
Joe.
called the yeah. So he views the War Rig as this really great allegory for Moby Dick, and Joe playing the
Ooh.
role of Captain Ahab. Um,
Mm.
I know you wanted to talk about like the scenes when they're like harpooning things and there's like bridges being built impromptu. And of course, everybody knows, everybody remembers the thing where Conan O'Brien spoofed the guy with the flamethrower guitar amp system thing going on.
Yes.
Yeah, so it's this really interesting thing where it takes this really old literature that some people think is potentially out of touch with modern day, and it does this really great juxtaposition where the sound designer is like, oh, this is totally a Captain Ahab Moby Dick story. This is all about the hunt for something. This is all about that kind of white whale and the futility of things and how anger kind of consumes you like a disease. And so I kind of love the idea of, because Moby Dick is something that Ray Bradbury wrote about in Leviathan 99 as one of my favorite Bradbury stories. So it's nice to see it coming
Mm.
up again in post-apocalyptic dystopia, though obviously Mad Max is not set in space, but is set in Australia.
Mm. In- Indeed. Yeah, speaking about the um flaming guitar. Oh, sorry. It's one of those little scenes that just stays with you
Talk about a
after you've watched
queer
the
moment.
film.
Only a queer person in dystopia would be like, I'm going to take this guitar and what little
Yeah.
electricity we have and put flames on top. There's nothing more like Bowie Mercury Hendrix esque than in the future saying,
Yeah.
I need to make a statement right now. That's what I'm doing.
Mhm. I'm over the I'm over the top, so I'm gonna say it with fire.
Yes.
It's fantastic. And there's no explanation for it. He just decides that he wants to be rocking out as if he's on the cover of a heavy metal album from the 80s.
So what's
That's
interesting about
fantastic.
that
Yeah.
scene too is that Mark Mangini actually
Mm.
did whale calls layered into sounds of the rig. So like the
Ooh.
harpooning, the blowholes, all the imagery is really in this kind of epic battle, this very harrowing experience. This really is about the idea of desert as ocean where you can be lost and swallowed, and it's all about the
Mm.
idea of there's almost like it's almost like you could argue that Fury Road is a pirate movie more than a western, especially with the scene. And I kind of like that it expands over different genres.
Mm. I mean, you could argue, yeah, I mean, they're boarding each other through
Yeah,
for the use of the vehicles and such. They're bombarding each other with weapons to each of their ships, air quotes there. Um, and
yeah.
and also I mean, the use of those poles to like for the soldiers to like jump across, or war boys, sorry, I think they were referred to. Um, on a brief little note before I forget, a little note of respect to Nicholas Hoult for his role in this movie.
Oh
Um,
yeah, I love
at
Nicholas
the
Holt. If you haven't seen Nicholas
Yeah.
Holt in the Great and the X-Men movies he was in, Nicholas Holt,
Mm.
he's a treasure.
He's lovely, and I appreciate him have being like a very steady actor, and he's probably one of the most successful actors to come out of the Skins TV show generation. The more I think about it, the more allegories for the whole sea aspect
Yeah.
theming it kind of springs to mind. And that's a very interesting way to take a desert apocalypse setting.
I mean, you
Mm,
could see the sandstorm that they have as sort of
yeah.
like a hurricane type thing because it's very
Mm.
powerful. It's very present. I can imagine that if this movie had come out in 3D the way George Miller originally intended it to before it became too expensive to do, that Sandstorm scheme would have been on par with the release of, because Phantom Menace released in IMAX and I got to see it in IMAX, and I have to tell you, like for all the people that hate on Phantom Menace in IMAX is an experience that you cannot forget. And there's something about I can almost imagine that sandstorm scene in 3D would have almost been too much for audiences. Like I love that it's almost too much. There's something so incredibly austere and yet decadent about Fury Road that I think is great.
Mm,
I also love, especially in this kind of war rig Moby Dick finale battle scene, several of the battle scenes, when you see the war boys and when you see Immortan Joe, they are essentially doing whiteface. Like they've covered themselves in like this white powder or white paint, whatever the whiteness is that
mm,
makes them uber
yeah.
white. And all the other characters in the film um, are, even if they're white, they have tones of pink to them. They are not like going for
Mm,
this like ghoul kind of mystique thing. And I
mm,
really like that juxtaposition. I like what it says. I like that you could read that as, oh, they're just trying to keep the sun out so that they're not too exposed. But it's also this like jarring juxtaposition of trying to maintain pureness, trying to maintain whiteness, othering yourself, which is
mm,
kind of part of the kind of feminist theme and talking about the violence against women. I can imagine Eve Ensler was
yeah.
like, yeah, this is part of it. By the way, George Miller's wife, whose name I could not find, I found her name is Margaret Sixel, and she edited the film. The film contains about 2,700 cuts in 120 minutes, which is
Wow.
really an interesting way to cut a film. Um,
Mm,
and I think it's better for it. You can compare that to
yeah.
Mad Max 2, which had 1,200 cuts in 90 minutes. Um,
Okay.
Also, the film
Interesting.
runs at below 24 frames per second, which is traditional for most films.
Mm,
Um, it actually got slowed down so you could see what was happening in the film more. So like the reason it feels so decadent in some of those battles likely is up to what was his name? The cinematographer they brought out of so John Seal, who's the cinematographer who has won many awards and has done movies like Gorillas in the Mist and Dead Poets Society, The English Patient, City of Angels, The Talented Mr. Ripley, The Perfect Storm, Cold Mountain. I'm listing a whole bunch of movies that I absolutely enjoy. Cold Mountain's a great movie, and it has a lot of themes of violence in it, which I think would so Fury Road paired with Cold Mountain could actually be a really interesting pairing as a film. But yeah, they brought John Seal out of retirement to do Mad Max Fury Road, and I think we're all better for that having happened.
they knew the right people that they wanted to get involved in this, and because they made the effort to get all those people together, it just created something like that goes beyond, just a summer blockbuster
Yeah,
as it was. It's a piece to me. Fury Road is a piece of art. It's a piece of
yeah,
cinematographic art, like the cinematography, the aesthetic. Oh, like the aesthetic all over is fantastic. We've touched upon the um giant sandstorm. I remember the moment that I saw that in the cinema, I was gobsmacked. Yes, it's CGI, but there's nothing that stops you making CGI, really good CGI, a piece of awesome
yeah.
art to look at. Like the
Well, we
huge
talked about
rolling
this.
shots.
We talked about
Mm,
this when we talked about Jumanji, about how when you
mm,
can use it, but you still have that physical presence there,
yeah.
that's when it's at its most potent. So
And you do get it. You get it from the ground position because you see the characters as they're very much aware that they're rapidly approaching something incredibly dangerous, but they still go into it. You get that sort of almost a second first person perspective
yeah,
of it. And so with the aesthetic of Fury Road, just a quick point about that. Um, there's so many beautiful scenes, and they take the time to show the landscapes and give you a real fullness of, even though a lot of the environment here is dangerous. For example, the the apocalyptic sandstorm.
Yes.
Even though like some of these elements are dangerous that they're showing, there's still sort of a captivating aspect to it, a beauty. And I think I did see actually that someone had done a piece of artwork of the sandstorm once, and they had made it like, they'd done a piece of like landscape art of it. So it's obviously imagery that really sticks with you
Yeah.
after you've watched it. Um,
And what's
and
interesting is that a lot of the Mad Max films are really travel stories. Mad Max himself, as is a wandering
yeah.
character, he doesn't really stay in communities for very long, and so a lot of these movies have that very Western feel of the art space, very very big spaces. But in tabletop gaming terms, Fury Road is very much a railroad movie where they stay on one road the whole time. So if this was like a tabletop campaign, as successful as it would be, you definitely would feel like you're being railroaded places. But I don't think that's bad necessarily. I think there's the Sandstorm theme is particularly interesting just for how important it is to the story. There's nothing
Mm.
in Fury Road to me that feels gratuitous. Like it could have been like, here, we're going to make this sandstorm. It's going to be CGI'd. Everyone's going to love it. And then have it be not effective to the film, but it's really effective to the film. It creates the fulcrum of the story. It gives Max and Furiosa a reason to see each other. It keeps Nux in the film as this court. Nux is a really great character because he's a sort of um, dangerous Chekhov's gun sort of thing, where he's going to screw everyone over eventually, but you don't know when. And then when it happens, you get your satisfying conclusion and you get the catharsis that theater goers really like, that we see in really, really great high art films. And it's also speaking about aesthetic. Mark Mangini, that did the sound for Mad Max Fury Road, also did the sound for one of my favorite sci-fi um, movies from 1997, from The Fifth Element. He lost to Titanic because everything lost to Titanic that year. But when you're talking about the idea of aesthetic, when you're talking about tying it with other dystopian franchises that explore themes of loneliness and home and community, The Fifth Element is part of kind of the grand tradition of this universe, even though they're not set necessarily in the same universe, but they could be. There's no reason they couldn't be. um, I know that Bruce Willis is no longer acting, but Bruce Willis and Tom Hardy in a buddy cop comedy would have given me so much joy. Let me tell you what.
Mm, that's quite, yeah. I mean, they could potentially still do like at least a comic
Yeah.
with Bruce and Tom's likenesses. So yeah, that might be
Yeah.
one way to
Well,
satisfy that
and
desire.
Judge Dredd was heavily influenced by the first Mad Max film, the idea of dystopia. So, like,
Mm.
Blade Runner and Judge Dredd both have kind of these hallmarks too, and they have their own versions of dystopia, the way that humanity grapples with things. Themes of home are really present in Mad Max Fury Road in a way that is not present in other sci-fi dystopia. In fact, in George Miller's body of work, especially in the Happy Feet movies, which it's weird to compare them, but George Miller also directed Happy Feet.
Woo!
Quite famously, did not have a good time directing Happy Feet so much. It's kind of like the people that directed Hercules, the Disney movie, really just wanted to make Treasure Planet, and they had to make Hercules in order to get the one they wanted done. It kind of feels like the same thing. Um, so the other big kind of theme in Fury Road, especially that we get from George Miller, is this examination of home. And I'm wondering if there are any scenes you can think of about the community or creation of home that that sparks in you as we're
Mm.
talking.
Um, well, it's the just thinking about it, like the so like the scene when um the mm, the all-female tribe, the Avatari, are welcoming Furiosa back into their arms and then welcoming her companions as well. Um, like even though their home is lost, like these people still accepting them um as they are. And also that touching scene where the old tribeswoman gives one of the concubines like the seeds that she has that she's been husbanding, um and te and is telling her that she's looking for somewhere to take them to grow. And they're heading back to the oasis and such. Um there's an interesting like continuation of like even though they don't have a home, they're being welcomed into this little like tribe and such, and then they're journeying to find a place in the latter part of the movie. Finding a place to belong is a very subtle theme throughout the movie
Yeah.
because it kind of gets eclipsed by the whole thing of like escaping to try and find somewhere better.
Yeah. And
Mm,
what's interesting
mm,
is that, especially if we're looking at the idea of the Western, of the prairie epic, that's a big part of it. The idea of a cowboy always journeying, always traveling, but in kind of a really niche, female driven prairie story. I'm thinking about Clan of the Cave
mm,
Bear by Jean M. Aoul. There's a lot of, when you think about both the women that are
mm,
traveling and even Furiosa herself, there's this idea of kind of going out and seeking, not necessarily of your own volition for like safety,
mm.
or to get away from something that wants to harm you. It's an interesting thing because the more layers you peel back on Fury Road, the more you see how it's both influenced and is influenced by things that have such deep meaning. Um,
Mm.
Something also to talk about is the idea this movie is, save for the scenes that are super violent, even some of them, there's something very fun about this movie. When we talk about art, often enough we don't talk about the fun, but a lot of people
Mm,
got a lot of joy from this movie. There's something very incredibly audacious and absurd and very queer. Once again,
mm.
about a guy playing a flame guitar, in the middle of this battle, but there's also something so incredibly audacious and heartbreaking about kind of the barrenness of the land and
Yeah.
its very weird, austere beauty in the way that only a desert can be beautiful.
Mm.
That I think works really well.
Yes, indeed. And I think another theme that is not really spoken about is the the persistent element of hope within this movie. Um, all of the cast on this journey are being driven by their own personal hope of what they're trying to strive towards, as it were. Like they're all, and even though the situation is very dark, and
Yeah,
like the barren, desolate environment of what was once, you know, our world stretches out around them and such. Like the cast still find it in themselves never to relinquish their hope. Like even at the very low point of when Furiosa discovers that the Green Paradise is gone, like what they've been striving to go to is gone, she still clings on to something. And then it's in Max to give her like the idea that maybe what they're striving for, the hope that they need to find, is going back, taking a stand, and like in a sense going back to where they started the journey, but turning it into something better to give the like people back there hope as well against
yeah,
what the situation is. Um, But that kind of all ties back into the whole elements of like redemption and the journey and everything. Like it's all like facets of that all coming together and interlinked with one another.
It does feel like Mad Max is a continuation of a conversation we've had about kind of war, independence, and humanity that we started in highly stylized faux war epics, essentially like 300.
Mm.
Like there's something about Fury Road that feels to me a little bit like uh, a much better. It's a much better story. I think it's a much better presentation in a lot of ways. Of
Mm.
300, which has this very male feeling to it, this very masculine fantasy. This has more of that feminism, more of that female fantasy. It doesn't relegate. Like you couldn't do this movie without Mad Max. Like if Tom Hardy wasn't in this movie, it wouldn't be as good. It wouldn't be as useful. Um, but there's something about Tom Hardy that plays this really great juxtaposition of feminine and masculine really well. And there's just enough submissiveness in him. There's just enough of Tom Hardy being bound. His
Mm.
mouth is covered in this movie for a portion of it. Um, that it allows Charlize Theron as Furiosa to shine, where in another director or another actor's hands, it may not have worked as well. It may have taken the air out of the room instead of giving Furiosa the ability to tell the story. Because it's really about
Mm.
her. I know in the trailer you see a lot of him,
Mm.
more than you see of her, but really in the movie, it's really her story. And I think that's a
Yes.
really interesting thing. In any other director's hands, like if this had been a Quentin Tarantino joint, we would have seen a lot more feet for one. But I can honestly imagine that any other director coming at this would have given Tom Hardy too big a role instead of just letting Tom Hardy do what he does best and then get out of the way for the main story. I'm so
Mm.
intrigued by a film where the main character, who's the main character of the franchise, is not the main character of this movie, and that's
Yeah.
okay. It's such an intriguing film as both a feminist piece and something that grapples with violence uh, without
Mm.
feeling gratuitous about it. But it's
Yes.
such an interesting thing to have an action movie where the male action star is almost beside the point of the movie, and
Mm.
he's not a walking plot device, but like
N-
when you look
No.
at the trailer versus the movie itself,
Yes.
you see so much of Tom Hardy in the trailer, and it's like it's really not his movie, but he's so okay with that. And I just
Mm.
appreciate that so much. And it's hard to like put into words. Like when you say it, it feels like you're not saying the right thing almost. Like, um,
Mm.
yeah.
Yeah, I know what you mean. Like the at one point the word catalyst came to mind, but I mean that's not true because it's Furiosa comes up with the plan and she's putting the plan in motion. Max just happens to be there in the right place at the right time to lend a hand and to help her succeed in
Yeah.
what her plan is. But she's the one that came up with this whole thing and like arranged for the concubines to get on the um
I
well, I
mean,
almost said bus for a second. It's not a bus, it's a
in a
truck tanker.
way, in a way, Mad Max as a prisoner, Tom Hardy as Mad Max is sort of a concubine of a Morden Joe in a different way than the women are. And I feel
Mm.
like if you took the word Mad Max out of the title and it was just Fury Road, Furiosa would still seem like a main character because the especially and maybe people, I don't know if people talking about this when they talk about the film, but the wives of this movie, as you have said, Splendid, Anna Garad, Toast to the Knowing,
Mm.
Capable, Dag, and Cheeto the Fragile. They go on this journey. They are not like these one-line characters. They each have a really important part to play. And really, Max's most important part to play is that blood transfusion that he gives to keep Furiosa going. But like he's not a side character in the movie. He's still very much one of the leads. But
Yeah.
he acts more as kind of this avatar to get Furiosa to the place where she's in charge. That doesn't sound right when I say it either.
No,
It's a really
it's
interesting fine line that only a director that knows the series intimately and asks their wife to cut it and brings on Eve Ensler, who created the vagina monologues. Like, it seems like with any other director, it probably would have fallen apart, or like it would have gotten recut by the WB to be
mm.
to be a sausage fest essentially. So like, I'm really glad for what we have, but it's such a
Yeah,
it's just it
yeah.
kind of should marvel people's minds more about how well this movie is constructed, I feel like.
Mm. It, oh yeah, totally agree with that. I think one last point I'd like to make about that before we start, I think, coming to our conclusions and such. Um, just even looking at the poster for the movie, the iconic poster for the movie has um Tom Hardy's Max muzzled looking ahead as they're driving, and it's Furiosa that's looking to the side and looking directly at the viewer. So she's clearly like the center point focus of what the viewer is meant to see in the poster and such. And so she's the main character by the poster, and Max is there as a major character presence, but it's clearly in a supportive aspect rather than being the focus point. And I think that kind of neatly sums up like their roles within the movie as well.
Yeah, it just yeah, I watched the trailer before we came on,
Mm.
just so the trailer was fresh in my mind, but they definitely, I feel like the executives like made sure the trailer was cut to give more Tom Hardy, just to kind of hedge their bets, because
Yeah.
executives are very gun shy, and this is the same people. These are the same. This is the same company that decided they didn't want Henry Cavill to be Superman anymore. So
Hmm.
we know they make bad decisions. But this is
Yeah.
just there's something. I will do my kind of wrap up thoughts first, and then you can just wax episodical, because this is really something that you kind of pushed us to talk about, which is really great. I'm glad I had an excuse to watch it again. Um, I think when you think of cinema that is art, and when you think of cinema specifically in 2010s, the decade, and maybe all of the 2000s, this is probably one of the best movies, not just to come out of that time period, but maybe um, high art action cinema altogether. I can easily see it standing with Star Wars Episode 4 in iconography, in people revisiting it, in the story that it tells, and in how much it references other things, but how it stands on its own. Um,
Yeah.
there's something really important that this film does, with Furiosa, and with all the wives, um, and it's really important that that line of Tom Hardy as Mad Max as being a major character but not being the main character is really, it's there, it's important. There's so much important stuff in this film, and it's actually hard to like talk about it and parse it down because it's all so interconnected. And so if you haven't seen it, or if you haven't seen it in a while, it might be time to revisit it. Mad Max Fury Road. You could even do a Mad Max night and watch all four in a row. That might be depressing a little bit, but I think it's a really good film. Which
Mm.
doesn't seem like high praise, but for me that's very high praise. Um,
Yes, and
being able to respond to an epic is something that isn't always done well. The only other real Americana epic, in a way that is close spiritually to it, that people just loved in theaters, was maybe Titanic. Is the only one that I can think of that would come close in my mind. Um, and that's all I'm going to say about it, because this is something that brings Magnus great joy. So I'm going to stop talking now.
oh, you can talk as much as you want, sir. I'm not gonna hog no limelight here. I've always been the sort of person to sit in the corner with my cup of tea, swill it in its cup, and just enjoy observing, shall we say. Um, but I shall take the center stage now. Um, you're right in the sense it's difficult to sum up with such a movie like this in a concise form how you generally feel about it. I go back to my initial experience of watching it in the cinema back in 2015, um, being blown away by every aspect of it, the action, the the character and the narrative, the all of the aesthetic and everything, and just knowing, even whilst I was in the middle of watching it, that this was something really special. Um, and I do feel that the studio had no idea exactly what had ended up being created. And this is the thing, when artists have the ability and the freedom to really get down and explore what they have, they can come up with something that can really capture and be revisited. And there is a lot of repeat watch value to this film. And to be fair, I mean, even though it's a Mad Max story, and maybe you can term it as a side story, even though it's a Mad Max story, it almost feels like it stands apart and, dare I say, slightly above the original trilogy. It will certainly encourage people to go back and rewatch the other trilogy, but as a standalone action, mm, it's just fantastic in every aspect. And I think you could almost argue that people will be rewatching this probably more than going back to the original trilogy. Not to diss Tina Turner and her Queen of the Wasteland role, because
Yes.
that in itself is an interesting spectacle to behold. Um,
I do wonder, because it's George Miller that has told all these stories, if you see glimpses of Fury Road and its kind of creation of community in spite of this wasteland, if you see that as themes and theses in the other films, because it's really set up in that way. The end of Fury Road is about Max disappearing,
Yeah.
as Furiosa is
Well,
being lifted up, and so I do wonder about that, if
well,
that's like common in the films.
well, he is the road warrior. He is the eternal wanderer through this wasteland. Um, almost feels like he's trying to find a purpose for himself in a world where once he was an agent of order and stability that has gone into a lawless environment. And he keeps stumbling on, and he might not actually realize it, but he keeps finding ways to have a purpose and to be useful for other people's stories and such. And even if he is doing it in a very begrudging manner, he's doing the right thing at times. And certainly, I mean, he did so in Fury Road. Um, but to get back to finishing off my thoughts on Fury Road, um, it's one of those things that just comes around every now and again and just takes everyone by surprise. Um, like oh, which one was it? Was it Batman: The Dark Knight that had Heath Ledger as the Joker?
Yeah, that was
Yeah,
part
was
of
it?
that whole trilogy,
Yeah. Mm.
which does
But
actually have some bridge to somebody that worked on that also worked on Mad Max Fury Road. But I don't want to interrupt you too much. So, but yeah, it
okay,
does have some
yeah.
link to that.
My main point is that every once in a while, the stars align. You'll get a film that is so beautifully crafted that it is a piece of art in its own right, but it also manages to touch a popular appeal that people can, like, the public really get it, and they really get invested in it and raise it up as a piece of art that's worth knowing. And um Fury Road was in the same vein as Batman: The Dark Knight, and you can totally see them being DVDs put together on people's shelves, along with other classics of which we've spoken of previously. Um, so yeah, to wrap up, like I think I struggle to actually find any overt criticism in my mind towards this film. Um, as much as it's difficult to watch sometimes, and it might not be everyone's cup of tea, I really do recommend giving it a try at least for the once, because you might be very pleasantly surprised by the end of your viewing about how you feel about it.
Yeah. In so much as Warner Brothers allows themselves to release R-rated films anymore, this is probably one of the best R-rated films ever released, because they weren't originally going to release it as an R-rated. They actually had a screening of a PG-13 cut that the test audiences didn't like enough. So the R-rated version we get is actually the George Miller cut, quote unquote, of the film. So we're actually seeing it in its kind of most artistic, purest form, which is really cool. And of course, Mad Max, if you like Mad Max, it did influence movies like The Terminator. James Cameron has often said there are shots in The Terminator that were influenced by Mad Max. Um, and it's really cool to be able to talk about something outside of a genre I normally love and be able to have such good things to say about it. It's kind of the opposite of the Santa Claus, where I feel like we dunked on it for a couple hours, essentially. But some movies need
Yeah.
that. It's
Mm.
so Fury Road is going to be one of the travel movies we talk about. There are a ton of other travel movies, and we have a ton of great content coming this year. Year two, we're in year two, if you can believe it. Woo!
Woo!
Yes, so obviously we have the archive still where all of season one is. We have all these places where you can listen into the podcast. If there's anything that you want to see, hear us talk about in this upcoming year, we're always open to ideas. So please hit us up on the Instagram, hit us up in the YouTube comments of our archives, because that's a good place for me to see the comments because I will see them. And yeah, we want to make this a conversation like all pop culture is.